Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Who dat? So on Tuesday, the NFL's 2-week window to use the franchise tag will open. So it opens on Tuesday, the 20th, and it'll close on Tuesday, March the 5th. And if you're not familiar, this is a tool that teams have in their arsenal to be able to maintain their free agent. If you have a free agent on your team and you haven't agreed to an extension with them, you could place the franchise tag on them. Now, it's expensive. The franchise tag is the average salary of the top 5 players at that position, or 120% of that player's previous salary, whichever is higher. So it's expensive to use the franchise tag, but it's a tool to be able to keep your free agents on your roster. It is unlikely the Saints will use the franchise tag. So for whatever it's worth, the Saints historically haven't used the franchise tag much anyway. They used it in 04 and 05 in back-to-back years on Darren Howard. Remember Darren Howard, the defensive end from Kansas State, is a really good player. In 07, they franchise tagged Charles Grant, but then ultimately agreed to a long-term deal with Charles Grant. Same thing with Drew Brees in 2012. Remember, they were coming off the new CBA, and Brees ultimately agreed to the 5-year, $100 million contract. And then the most infamous year that the Saints used the franchise tag was 2014 on Jimmy Graham. And then Jimmy Graham took the Saints to arbitration, where he was trying to say that he was a receiver and not a tight end, because obviously the average of the top 5 contracts of receivers is much higher than tight ends. That was the large dispute. Ultimately, they agreed to an extension, but a year later, the Saints had traded Jimmy Graham to Seattle. It was sort of like that was the irreparable harm that was done. And then in 2021, Marcus Williams played under the franchise tag, and then they did not agree to a long-term deal, and as we know, he agreed. He left for the Ravens. So since 2004, the Saints have only used the franchise tag 6 times since 2004. So number one, the Saints don't use it that much. And then when you look at this year's roster, the Saints last year were very they were preemptive and aggressive in the way that they went about signing their free agents. They signed Carl Granderson to an extension. Remember, they extended Cam Jordan last year as well. Cesar Ruiz, another player, they got the deal done last year before they hit unrestricted free agency. So the only 2 players really on this year's team that you'd look and say, okay, well, who might the Saints, what free agents might the Saints even be interested in franchise tagging? The 2 that we talked most prominently about that could hit free agency are Jameis Winston and Michael Thomas. Thomas's deal is a little bit different, but we could look at that one too, just as a for instance. So Jameis, if they were to franchise tag Jameis, you'd have to pay him an average of the top 5 salaries of quarterbacks in the NFL. The expected franchise tag number for quarterbacks this year is $36.2 million. Needless to say, the Saints are not going to pay Jameis Winston $36.2 million. So you're not going to franchise tag Jameis. And then if you wanted to look at Michael Thomas, like the franchise tag number for receivers this year would be $20.2 million. Now, again, it could be 120% of the previous year's salary, whichever is higher. For Thomas, it would be the $20.2 million. But for example, a guy like Mike Evans in Tampa, who is a free agent, his number, if the Bucks were to franchise tag Mike Evans, his number would be $28.4 million. So, like, they ain't going to franchise tag Mike Evans. So, they're not going to pay Mike Evans $28 million. So, you look at it and you say the Saints probably aren't a candidate to franchise tag any of their players this year. It's just something worth keeping an eye on. I'm going to be more interested in what happens around the division, because, like I just mentioned, Mike Evans is a free agent. Could Mike Evans' time in Tampa be done? I mean, he's the best receiver in the history of that organization, and he's a likely Hall of Famer, but his time in Tampa could be done. So if Baker Mayfield is back, could Baker Mayfield be back without his best receiver? Potentially. Carolina, the player most likely, when you look at the Carolina media, who they're talking about as a most likely player to be franchise tagged is Brian Burns. Well, Brian Burns has been a really good pass rusher, but he's an outside linebacker. He kind of has a similar conundrum that Jimmy Graham had back in the day. You'd much rather be franchise tagged as a defensive end than an outside linebacker because the difference in the numbers is pretty significant with how you're going to be franchise tagged. So we'll wait and see what teams elect to use the franchise tag, but as that window opens on Tuesday. But it's just unlikely that there's any player that makes sense for the Saints to franchise tag. It's going to be more of an interesting storyline looking around the rest of the division and around the rest of the league to see what players might be up for the tag. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact, and be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.